We're looking at part C, still talking about blood vessels. And now we want to talk about the control of blood flow. So we want to look at tissue perfusion, which is a term that we've introduced in part B. And we just want to make sure that the terms microcirculation and tissue perfusion are defined. So microcirculation is blood flow through a capillary bed, but doesn't necessarily have to do with sharing what's in the blood with tissues. But tissue perfusion does. This is blood flow through body tissues. So of course, first the blood has to flow through a capillary bed in order to be exchanged. Tissue perfusion includes the delivery of oxygen and nutrients to and the removal of waste from tissue cells. It's also going to include gas exchange, so that's specifically of respiratory gases. This occurs both in the lungs and at tissues, and the absorption of nutrients in the small intestine, so the absorption of nutrients into the blood, and then urine formation, which is going to be a process that includes things like tubular reabsorption and tubular secretion, which is a back and forth transport of things from the blood to the kidney tubules. The rate of flow to tissues is precisely the right amount in order to provide the proper amount of nutrients and gases for that organ or tissue to function. So the rate of blood flow is controlled by extrinsic and extrinsic factors. So extrinsic and intrinsic factors. Extrinsic controls include the sympathetic nervous system, so neural control, and hormones, and they control blood flow through the whole body. The extrinsic controls, so the nervous system and hormones, are able to act on arteriolar smooth muscle in order to reduce the flow of blood to certain regions that need it the least. So for example, if you're exercising, your digestive organs don't need the blood as much as your skeletal muscles. Intrinsic controls include autoregulation. This autoregulation or local control of blood flow generally acts on arterioles, and this blood flow, when it's autoregulated, will be adjusted locally to meet specific tissue requirements. So this would happen as arterioles that feed capillaries modify their diameters, and that would regulate the flow of blood to organs. And the difference between extrinsic and intrinsic control, because you're probably thinking they sound very similar, is just what is controlling arteriolar diameter. Is it outside forces? Is it hormones released from endocrine glands or the nervous system? Or is it a response of muscle to chemicals that are in the area of the tissue? So it just depends what is controlling the regulation of arteriolar diameter. So you can see that the extrinsic controls, that's control from the outside of the tissue or organ. We see use of nerves or the nervous system and hormones for extrinsic control, whereas the intrinsic controls, that's going to be local. It's generally termed autoregulation instead of calling it local control, and the control is entirely from within the tissue or organ. Oftentimes, the chemicals that are going to initiate the intrinsic controls that regulate blood flow are going to be or act as paracrines, meaning that they're produced by cells nearby or come out of tissues nearby, and they're going to act on other tissue cells, in this case, generally the smooth muscle of arterioles. Examples where both control mechanisms may or may not occur include stroke volume in the heart, arteriolar diameter, and glomerular filtration in the kidneys. One we already talked about, another we're getting into, and then glomerular filtration in the kidneys will be talked about in chapter 24. Control of blood flow requires the redistribution of blood during certain activities, such as, for example, during exercise. At rest, your skeletal muscles receive only about 20% of the total blood volume in the body. But during exercise, we'll see that increase, where skeletal muscles can receive up to about 70% of the blood in the body. And this is regulated by intrinsic and extrinsic controls. The intrinsic controls are going to see skeletal muscle arterioles dilate, and that will increase blood flow to muscle. So that is going to be controlled by the skeletal muscle itself. Whereas extrinsic controls are also active, and they'll decrease blood flow to other organs such as the kidneys and digestive organs, which at this point in time when someone is exercising do not need as much blood flow. However, we're going to maintain mean arterial pressure despite the dilation of skeletal muscle arterioles. Just like the overall pressure in the plumbing at your house is maintained, even though the pressure in one location changes slightly if you say turn on your kitchen sink. So here is a picture of figure 18.15 showing the distribution of blood flow at rest and during strenuous exercise. So we can see that the amount of total blood flow going to skeletal muscles at rest is vastly less than the amount of total blood flow going to skeletal muscles when someone is strenuously exercising. So we can see, because of intrinsic and extrinsic regulation, changes in blood flow. We are going to focus now, though, mainly on the intrinsic or local regulation of blood flow called autoregulation. Generally, this is the one that's a little harder to understand, so we want to spend some time on it. Autoregulation involves, again, those local conditions, the intrinsic conditions, basically the tissue regulating its own blood flow. And these conditions are going to be able to regulate blood flow to that area in order to achieve reactive hyperemia or increase blood flow to an area due to intrinsic factors. There's two different types of intrinsic mechanisms. Both are able to determine the final autoregulatory response, and these two mechanisms of intrinsic autoregulation are metabolic and myogenic. With the metabolic control, we'll see an increase in tissue metabolic activities result in decreasing levels of oxygen, increasing levels of metabolic products such as hydrogen ions, potassium ions, adenosine, and prostaglandins. And the effect of declining oxygen but increasing metabolic products is going to cause direct relaxation of arterioles and relaxation of precapillary sphincters. It also causes the release of nitric oxide, which is a powerful vasodilator. Nitric oxide is released by endothelial cells. Metabolic controls such as endothelin, also released from endothelium, are potent vasoconstrictors. So normally we would have both nitric oxide and endothelium being released from endothelial cells, and they would balance each other out. So we wouldn't see any vast vasoconstriction or sudden vasodilation. But in a case where autoregulation is regulating blood flow, nitric oxide wins control, and this would cause vasodilation. Inflammatory chemicals can also cause vasodilation. So in the case that inflammation is occurring in blood vessels, you may see vasodilation, which increases blood flow in order to bring with it white blood cells and other chemicals that help promote healing and or flush out the area so that inflammation dies down. With the myogenic controls, myogenic is talking about some type of muscle movement or muscle generating movement that allows for intrinsic or autoregulation of blood flow. So myomuscle, just keep that in mind. But with the myogenic responses, it's a local vascular smooth muscle that's able to respond to changes in mean arterial pressure in order to keep perfusion constant to avoid damage to tissue. For example, passive stretch, meaning increased mean arterial pressure or blood pressure to an arteriole, stretches a vessel wall more than normal. Smooth muscle of that arteriolar wall in response would constrict. So you stretch it, it means that we have high blood pressure. That blood vessel is going to constrict in order to decrease blood flow to the tissue so that we don't have a damaging amount of blood pressure in the capillary where exchange would take place. Whereas if there's reduced stretch, meaning there's decreased mean arterial pressure or blood pressure, that means less stretch on the arteriolar wall than normal, then we would see smooth muscle respond by dilating in order to increase blood flow to maintain an adequate amount of tissue perfusion to an organ. And then, of course, there's long-term autoregulation, still intrinsic, but long-term autoregulation is going to occur when that short-term autoregulation is just still not able to meet tissue nutrient requirements, when both the metabolic and myogenic mechanisms are not enough to sustain tissue perfusion. Long-term autoregulation may have to begin. And long-term autoregulation takes a while to kind of ramp up. It may take weeks or months in order to actually increase blood supply. And so during that time, we may see a number of vessels to that region increase, or we may see the production of new blood vessels. That process is called angiogenesis. And that is just kind of the most immediate response or thing that we can recognize as a part of long-term autoregulation. And so if we add to the number of blood vessels going to a region or to a tissue, that increases the amount of tissue perfusion that can occur to a tissue, but also kind of the collateral channels to which blood can take. And this is very common in the heart. We have coronary vessels that could be occluded, and so it's helpful to have collateral channels through which blood can flow to the myocardium. This can also occur in individuals throughout their body if they're traveling to high altitude areas. So to summarize our kind of metabolic, myogenic, and even non-hormonal mechanisms for vasodilation and vasoconstriction, you have figure 18.16, looking at both the intrinsic and extrinsic controls of blood flow. And what we're controlling is the arteriolar diameter. So we're controlling or acting upon smooth muscle in the arterioles. So again, the metabolism controls are just saying that when we can tell a tissue doesn't have oxygen because waste products like CO2, hydrogen ions, and potassium are building up, that also includes prostaglandins, adenosine, even nitric oxide, when metabolites that are saying, hey, this tissue is performing metabolism and these are waste products or these are things produced by metabolism and they're definitely running out of oxygen, then the metabolic mechanism of autoregulation will cause vasodilation or lead to nitric oxide release. We move down here, something that causes vasoconstriction metabolically is the release of endothelin. The myogenic response, again, is intrinsic, and we would see that stretch of smooth muscle in the arterial walls causes vasoconstriction, whereas lack of stretch would cause vasodilation. So those are our intrinsic autoregulatory controls, again, metabolic or myogenic, and we would see that these are distributing blood flow to individual organs and tissues as needed. It's when the tissue or organ itself controls blood flow by controlling the arterial or smooth muscle diameter. But of course, there's also the extrinsic control, which was neurohormonal. If we increase sympathetic tone, we would cause vasoconstriction. If we decrease it, it would cause vasodilation. And then we have to remember the hormones that can cause vasodilation and constriction. Atrial natriuretic peptide is an antagonist to aldosterone, which can be produced by the production of angiotensin II. And that means that they do opposite each other. So it makes sense that they're opposite each other in function in this list. Atrial natriuretic peptide can lead to vasodilation, whereas angiotensin II and then later aldosterone can lead to vasoconstriction. And then we've talked already about antidiuretic hormone, epinephrine and norepinephrine, that can also increase blood pressure. And they increase blood pressure by causing vasoconstriction. So when we're talking about extrinsic controls that regulate arterial or smooth muscle, specifically in systemic circulation, we're looking at normal hormonal controls, how they maintain mean arterial pressure or kind of overall arterial pressure, including peripheral resistance times cardiac output as the equation there, and then how it's redistributed during exercise. We want to kind of hark back to that image that showed how the skeletal muscle may receive more blood during strenuous exercise, and that is due to the fact that blood is redistributed for things like exercise and thermoregulation by either neurohormonal mechanisms. So just make sure to review that image. It's a good study material. Next, let's just look at some blood flow in special areas. So this isn't too specific. We just want to generalize these specific areas since we just got done talking about blood flow and how it's regulated. So for example, blood flow to skeletal muscle varies with fiber type, with activity. At rest, the myogenic and neural mechanisms for autoregulation of arterial diameter are going to really predominate. And then active or exercise hyperemia occurs during muscle activity. So active or exercise hyperemia is just excess blood flow. So hyperemia is blood flow to a tissue, and we see that blood flow to a tissue increases in direct proportion to metabolic activity of cells. So if you're exercising, you're going to increase metabolic activity of cells. Local controls can override the sympathetic vasoconstriction, or we could say they're the neural control that causes vasoconstriction, and that override can increase flow to about 10 times the amount. So here's an example of active hyperemia. So exercising skeletal muscle is going to use oxygen and produce metabolites and waste products, which will cause the production or overproduction of nitric oxide from endothelial cells, and therefore vasodilation will occur. This vasodilation is of arterioles, and it does override the extrinsic sympathetic input, which is generally the main extrinsic control of skeletal muscle hyperemia. But this override will increase muscle blood flow, and this is what we're calling active hyperemia. That's our result. Next, let's look at the brain. So blood flow to the brain must be constant because neurons are intolerant of ischemia. I read that verbatim because it's an important fact. Neurons are very intolerant of becoming ischemic or lacking oxygen, not being able to use oxygen in order to create ATP. So the flow to the brain actually averages about 750 milliliters per minute, and the control mechanisms are mainly metabolic, wherein decreased pH or excess hydrogen ion production and other metabolites such as increased carbon dioxide production can mark or cause vasodilation. So very high CO2 levels actually would depress the autoregulatory mechanism, and that would be very high carbon dioxide levels, and that can have a very negative effect on blood flow to the brain. The control mechanisms we're looking at are majorly metabolic, but myogenic can take over, and generally this would be used, the myogenic controls would be if there was decreased mean arterial pressure that caused cerebral vessels to dilate and increased mean arterial pressure causing cerebral vessels to constrict. So that response to stretch or lack of stretch causing either constriction or dilation respectively would be the myogenic controls. So the brain is very vulnerable under extreme systemic pressure, so any changes that are below 60 millimeters of mercury or above 160 millimeters of mercury can result in an abnormal response. So if mean arterial pressure is low, it can cause fainting, which is syncope. If it's high, it can result in cerebral edema, which is very dangerous as pushing on the brainstem. It could actually lead to death. Our next special area to examine blood flow in is the skin, and the skin has a couple of various functions when it comes to blood flow through the skin. For example, blood flow in the dermis is supplying nutrients to cells, for example, of the epidermis, because epithelial cells do not have their own vascularization. And this is just autoregulated in response to oxygen needs, so it's going to be metabolically autoregulated. We also see that the skin helps us regulate our body temperature, and this is a neurally controlled mechanism, which is a very important function of the skin. It's deemed thermoregulation. If you want to know more about thermoregulation, make sure to go back to chapter 5 over the integument to look at that skin function. And then we talked about the skin providing we talked about the veins providing an important blood reservoir, but a lot of the dermal venous structures, which are also neurally controlled, are able to store or act as a reservoir for this blood. So blood flow through venous plexi below the skin is actually the area that is utilized to regulate body temperature or perform thermoregulation. And flow in these venous plexi varies from about 50 milliliters per minute to 2,500 milliliters per minute. That does depend on body temperature. Because flow is controlled neurally by the sympathetic nervous system of the autonomic nervous system, it's generally reflexive. And these reflexes are initiated by temperature receptors and the central nervous system. Some of these temperature receptors have to communicate with the boss of the autonomic nervous system, the hypothalamus, also known as the body's thermostat. So essentially with thermoregulation, as temperature rises, so whether you're outside, starting to warm up now, and this is being caused maybe by heat exposure or maybe because you have a fever or you just got done exercising, whatever the reason temperature in the body is rising, it will initiate hypothalamic signals to reduce vasomotor stimulation of the skin vessels, so those venous plexi, and that would cause dilation of them. And when there's dilation of blood vessels, there's more room for blood, so that causes warm blood to flush into these capillary beds that are in the dermis of the skin, and they're close enough to the surface of the skin that heat's able to radiate out of the dermis and through the epidermis out into the environment. We see the opposite occur if temperature decreases. Maybe it's cold outside, or for some reason blood is being shunted to your deeper, more vital organs. Whatever the reason, if the temperature decreases, that actually causes the superficial skin vessels, the venous plexi, to constrict. And if they constrict, blood can't flow into them as easily, and some of that blood actually becomes trapped. That's what causes rosy cheeks in the cold. But the other blood is going to be shunted away from the skin into deeper organs. And that'll help kind of warm your core. Our next area is going to be the lungs, and the pulmonary circuit is unusual because it's a short pathway from the heart to the lungs and back, and it does include arteries and arterioles and veins and venules, but we find that the arteries and arterioles are more like the veins and venules in the pulmonary circuit. So the arteries and arterioles of the pulmonary circuit tend to be thin-walled and have large lumens. That's okay because the pulmonary circuit is low pressure. So the arterial resistance and pressure are not as high as in the systemic circuit. It only averages about 24 over 10 millimeters of mercury versus kind of on average arterial circuit of the systemic system at 120 over 80 millimeters of mercury. We're going to see that in the lungs, the autoregulatory mechanisms are the opposite. So low oxygen levels are going to cause vasoconstriction, where everywhere else we saw that low oxygen levels caused vasodilation, because if a tissue had low oxygen, you would want the blood to go there, so vasodilation could ensure that. But in the lungs, we do not want to send blood where there are low oxygen levels, because the point of the blood going to the lungs is to get more oxygen, to become oxygenated, because it's deoxygenated blood that goes to the pulmonary capillaries. So again, the autoregulatory mechanism of the lungs is the opposite when it comes to blood flow. It's when there's low oxygen levels that we see vasoconstriction, and high oxygen levels that we promote vasodilation. And this ensures that oxygen-rich blood is able to leave the lungs. So we're going to make sure that we allow blood flow to the oxygen-rich areas of the lungs or near the alveoli or air spaces carrying the most oxygen in order to have the appropriate amount of respiratory gas exchange. Another special area we want to look at is the heart. Blood flow through the heart is influenced by the aortic pressures and ventricular pumping. So we looked at the pressure and volume changes through the heart via the cardiac cycle, and during the cardiac cycle, you were introduced to the stage called ventricular systole. And during ventricular systole, the coronary vessels are compressed because this is the contraction phase of the cardiac cycle. This compression leads to myocardial blood flow ceasing, and thankfully we have stored myoglobin that exist within the myocardium cells or the cardiac myocytes, and this is able to supply sufficient oxygen during the stage of ventricular systole. So essentially we have a special protein that holds onto the oxygen delivered during ventricular diastole, and this stored oxygen is what is supplied to the myocardial myocytes and other heart tissues during the ceasing of myocardial blood flow during ventricular systole. So again, during diastole, the high aortic pressures are able to force blood through coronary circulation, so not a problem there. At rest, coronary blood flow is only about 250 milliliters per minute, which is still quite fast, but the control is probably via mainly myogenic mechanisms. We're not 100% sure. We do know that during strenuous exercise that the coronary vessels do dilate more than when we are not exercising or we're at rest, and this is in response to local accumulation of vasodilators. So it might be slightly metabolic or both. Blood flow may increase 3 to 4 times during strenuous exercise of the heart, and we would see that the coronary blood flow is important because cardiac cells use 65% of the oxygen that's delivered to cardiac myocytes, and other cells in comparison only use about 25% of the delivered oxygen. So increasing coronary blood flow is the only way to provide more oxygen to cardiac myocytes, and that blood flow increase again is seen most often during active hyperemia of the heart. All right, next we're going to be looking at the velocity of flow, and the velocity of blood flow definitely changes as blood travels through systemic circulation, which we've acknowledged a little bit at this point. We know that blood pressure is going to be the highest at the aorta, and it's going to drop off kind of over time throughout the systemic circuit and be the lowest in the veins. So make sure to watch that next.